My father's furious gaze made my whole body tremble. At that moment, I wished the ground would swallow me whole. The rage on my mother Isabella's face was like an avalanche about to crash down on me. We were gathered around the old, creaking wooden table, but it wasn't a warm family dinner or a heartfelt conversation. There were only my father's deep breaths and a suffocating silence. And that silence shattered abruptly when my father slammed his fist on the table. "Who?" my father roared, his voice filling the entire room. "Who did this disgraceful thing, Sophia?" My hands instinctively went to my stomach, and tears burned my cheeks as they streamed down. Words caught in my throat. No matter how hard I tried to speak, only a muffled murmur escaped my lips. My father's voice echoed again, this time even more forcefully. "Answer me, Sophia. How could you bring this shame upon us? Who is this man?" I didn't mean," I stammered. My voice trembled and my words crumbled. "It was a mistake. A mistake." My father struck the edge of the table so hard it nearly splintered. "Getting pregnant at 13 is a mistake? Do you even realize the disgrace you've brought upon us?" My mother intervened, not to defend me, but to fuel my father's anger further. "Louis, it's pointless to talk. This girl has no shame left. While we were protecting and providing for her without a second thought, she brought this humiliation upon us. Shame on you, Sophia." I closed my eyes, wishing for everything to disappear for a moment, but reality gnawed at my mind. Mark. The boy who had just moved into the neighborhood with his warm smile that made me believe in the world. He had stolen my innocent heart and bound me with endless promises. But one night in the park had changed everything. Mark's persistence, my fear. I had wanted to say no, but my voice had failed me. "Do you have any idea what kind of disgrace I'm living with, Sophia?" My mother's cold voice yanked me back to reality. "The people on the street, the neighbors, the relatives, everyone will be talking about how far we've fallen. You've ruined us." "Mom, please," I managed to say. The knots in my throat wouldn't loosen. "I can tell you everything. Please listen to me. Don't shut me out." My mother let out a mocking laugh. "Listen, there's no place for you in this house anymore. You have to leave. I can't accept such a disgrace. We can't show our faces in public anymore." I turned to my father with one last hope. I searched for a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, but he shook his head and turned his back on me. "Your mother is right," he said. "I can't keep a daughter like you in this house. Pack your things and leave. From now on, whatever you do, this house is closed to you." "Please," I cried out, summoning all my strength. "I have nowhere to go. I don't know what to do." But there was no response. Neither my mother nor my father looked at me. At that moment, I heard whispers from outside. Neighbors were peeking through the window, watching us. Shame consumed my entire being. My father opened the door and with a harsh voice said, "Get out." I walked out of that house in tears. As I wandered under the dim streetlights, shivering in my damp clothes, the warmth of the home I had left behind froze within me. I was utterly alone now. The tiny life growing inside me was my sole responsibility. But this burden was far heavier than a child could bear. That night, loneliness, cold, and fear engulfed me, yet I knew this was only the beginning. Darker and more merciless days lay ahead. As the rain poured relentlessly over me, my feet carried me forward, not knowing where they were taking me. My tears mixed with the falling rain. No one would notice I was crying. My family had cast me out. I was homeless. I was scared. And I was alone. I sat on a park bench, my wet clothes clinging to my body. Wrapping my arms protectively around my stomach, I curled into a corner. "I'll protect you," I whispered to the baby growing inside me. But even as I said those words, I didn't believe myself. Laughter echoed from a few streets away, drunken voices. I looked around in fear, but I had nowhere to go. Soon, I started shivering. Even after the rain stopped, The cold clung to me. I needed to find a place, a warm place. I stood up and began wandering aimlessly. My eyes caught sight of a building. It looked old and abandoned. Gathering my courage, I approached the door. It creaked as it opened, but the moment I stepped inside, a harsh voice rang out. "Hey, what are you doing here?" A man yelled, his brows furrowed, hands on his hips. He was middle-aged and his face showed no sign of kindness. I just need a place to stay for the night," I said, my voice trembling. "Please, I won't bother anyone." The man's glare hardened. "You can't stay here. Get out of here. I'm not taking responsibility for you," he snapped and slammed the door in my face. The sound of the door closing felt like it shattered something inside me. My shoulders sagged as I was left alone once again. Slowly, I turned back and kept walking through the streets. The dark alleys grew more and more intimidating. I found a corner of a park and tried to settle there, but just as I sat down, a group of men's voices startled me. "Hey, young lady, what are you doing out here at this hour?" one of them said, his tone mocking. The others laughed as they approached me. My heart started pounding wildly. "I didn't do anything. Please, just leave me alone," I said. But my words didn't stop them. "Don't be so scared," one said, his grin growing unsettlingly wide. "We just want to have some fun. You can join us." I froze. My brain was searching for an escape, but my body wouldn't move. The only thing I could do was run. I took a step back and then bolted. My heart was racing in my chest. The rain had started again, and my feet slipped on the muddy ground, but I didn't stop. I could hear their footsteps and laughter behind me. "You can't run forever. Where are you gonna go?" they yelled. But I found a narrow alley and quickly darted into it. Luckily, when I turned a corner, they didn't see me. I collapsed against a wall, gasping for breath, my body trembling. "God, why?" I whispered. "Why is everyone against me? Why is everything so hard?" That night, I sought shelter under a tree in the park. The rain was still falling, the cold seeping into my bones. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to sleep, but the fears in my mind wouldn't let me rest. My family, the men chasing me, the crushing loneliness. They consumed my thoughts. In the early hours of the morning, a gentle voice woke me. "Child, what are you doing here?" asked an elderly woman bending over me with an umbrella in her hand. I slowly opened my eyes and could make out her silhouette. "I don't know," I murmured, my eyes fluttering closed again. "Don't worry, I'll take care of you," she said softly. Her arms lifted me gently. For the first time in my life, I felt warmth, both physical and emotional. She shielded me from the cold, and perhaps for the first time, someone truly cared about me. When I opened my eyes, I realized I was sitting in a chair. The room was small, but the smell of fresh bread filled the air, warming me from the inside. Steam rose from a teapot boiling on a stove, wrapping the room in a comforting haze. My head still felt dizzy, but the chill and fear of the previous night were impossible to forget. "So, you're awake," said an elderly woman as she approached me with a cup of warm milk in her hand. Her eyes held both kindness and a deep weariness. "My name is Margaret. When I found you outside, you were on the verge of passing out. Here, drink this and try to gather yourself." Her voice was so soft that I couldn't hold back the tears welling in my eyes. "Thank you," I said, noticing my hands trembling as I took the cup. I was just looking for a place to stay." Margaret nodded. "I understand, child. But no one your age should be alone and pregnant. If you want to share your story, I'll listen, but you don't have to." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The thought of sharing my story with a stranger scared me. But at the same time, I desperately needed someone to help carry the weight inside me. Staring at the floor, I began to speak. "My family kicked me out," I said, my voice shaking. "When they found out I was pregnant, my father was so furious. My mother didn't stand by me either. They said I was a disgrace to them and threw me out of the house." Margaret stayed silent for a while. My words filled the room, but her expression showed neither judgment nor pity. And the father? Where is he? Did he leave you to face this alone? My eyes filled with tears again. He lied to me. There was someone I thought I loved, but he only used me for his own gain. When he found out I was pregnant, he disappeared. Now I don't know what to do. Margaret took a deep breath, held my hand, and gave it a gentle squeeze. Listen to me, child. Everyone makes mistakes, but the important thing is not letting those mistakes define you. You're here now, and that's a start. I'll help you. Her words warmed me, but I could still feel the crushing weight of my situation. At that moment, a loud growl from my stomach embarrassed me. Margaret chuckled softly. Let's fill your belly first. You can't think or solve problems on an empty stomach. At the table, she placed a plate of fresh bread and some cheese in front of me. As I took my first bite, I realized just how hungry I was, and I couldn't hold back my tears once again. Margaret noticed but said nothing, simply smiling and nodding. You can stay here, she said after a while, but it won't be easy. People, especially in this neighborhood, can be quick to lose their compassion. I'll do everything I can to help you build a life from here, but you have to be strong. I understood what she meant. Even someone like her helping me would bring gossip and judgment from the neighbors. But I had no other choice. Taking a deep breath, I nodded. I'll do my best too. I don't want to make things harder for you. Margaret smiled warmly. Then we begin, she said. From today, we're like family. Under this roof, no matter what, we'll support each other. Those words were something I hadn't dared to hope for in a long time, a family. For the first time, I didn't feel completely alone, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't last. The nights I'd spent on the streets and the judgmental stares of people were still etched into my memory. I sensed they would find me again. That night, I fell asleep in Margaret's warm home, but my mind was still in turmoil, haunted by the hardships I'd faced, the people I'd left behind, and the uncertain path ahead. Yet one thing was clear. This elderly woman had already given me hope, and I was determined to hold on to it and fight for it. During my first few days with Margaret, I found a momentary refuge in her warm kindness. But the stares, murmurs, and unsettling whispers of the people in the neighborhood never seemed to leave me. Every time I stepped outside the bakery's door, a cold chill washed over me. I could feel their eyes on me, judging, scrutinizing. One morning, Margaret and I were cleaning the tables in the bakery. The sound of the bell above the door startled me. A middle-aged man walked in, wearing a thick coat. The stern expression on his face made it clear he wasn't there for a friendly visit. "Margaret," the man said in a gruff voice, "we need to talk." Margaret dried her hands and walked toward him, a slight frown forming on her face. "What do you want to talk about, Esteban?" The man's eyes found me, and with a dismissive gesture, he pointed in my direction. "This girl. If you keep her here, you're asking for trouble. People in this neighborhood are talking. You're putting your bakery at risk." Margaret stood firm in front of Esteban. "This bakery is mine. You don't get to decide who I keep here." Esteban's voice rose, growing more insistent. "You have to think about the consequences. What will you do if no one buys bread from you anymore? Do you even know this girl's history? Her own family threw her out. By keeping her here, you're ruining your own reputation." Margaret's eyes hardened. "I don't let fear dictate my reputation. If someone doesn't want to shop here, they're free to leave. But think twice before you say anything to Sophia. You don't know her story." Esteban took a step closer, unwilling to back down. "Margaret, people have already started boycotting your bakery because of her. How much longer can you hold out? Stubbornness will only take you so far." Margaret slammed the cloth she was holding onto the table. "I don't need your advice, Esteban. And this conversation is over. If you don't have anything else to say, don't forget to close the door on your way out." Esteban's face flushed with anger, but he left without another word, slamming the door behind him. Margaret took a deep breath before turning to me. Her eyes were still burning with anger, but her voice was calm. Don't let people like him get to you, Sophia. Their words don't define you. I looked at her with gratitude, but a growing fear lingered inside me. I was putting Margaret in a difficult position, and the thought of it weighed heavily on me. It was clear that people didn't want me here. But where else could I go? Not knowing the answer to that question made me feel even more helpless. One day, I stepped out back to take out the trash. The moment I shut the door, I noticed a group of young men staring at me. One of them smirked maliciously. "Hey, you don't belong here," one of them said. The others joined in, laughing mockingly. I took a step back in fear. "I'm just taking out the trash. Please leave me alone," I said, my voice trembling. The man stepped closer, leaning toward me with a sneer. "What's someone like you doing in this neighborhood? Don't you get it? People don't want you here." "Enough!" Margaret's voice cut through the air like a blade. I turned to see her marching toward us with a broom in hand. "If any of you come near her again, you'll have to deal with me." The young men seemed taken aback by Margaret's fiery glare. One of them muttered, "This place isn't for people like her." "But suit yourself," before leading his friends away. Margaret dropped the broom and turned to me. She placed her hands firmly on my shoulders, looking directly into my eyes. "Sophia, no matter how frightening people may seem, you can't give up. This bakery is a home, and in this home, you're not alone." Her words brought me a small sense of comfort, but I couldn't stop thinking about how far people might go. Would Margaret's kindness be enough to withstand their hostility? I didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain. I would do everything in my power to protect the warmth she had given me. Margaret's bakery was my sanctuary, but the anger and gossip of the neighborhood cast a shadow over this safe haven. Every morning, as I prepared the dough, I tried to ignore the stares, taunts, and even direct threats from the townsfolk. But it was far from easy. Margaret always stepped in to defend me, standing up to them without hesitation. Yet, this constant conflict weighed heavily on me. I didn't want to cause her any more harm. One morning, as I swept the bakery's entrance, I could hear Margaret speaking with a customer inside. Suddenly, a group of people stepped out of the shop across the street and started talking loudly while looking directly at me. "Look at her," one woman said, her voice sharp as a needle. "Margaret must have lost her mind. Who would keep someone like that around?" Another laughed mockingly. "Exactly. Even her own family didn't want her. Now she's here, ruining other people's lives." Their words pierced through me like a knife. I lowered my head and kept sweeping, unable to summon the courage to meet their eyes. But I couldn't suppress the growing anger inside me. How dare they treat me like this? They didn't know anything about me, my story, my pain, my struggles, yet they judged me as if they knew it all. Margaret must have noticed what was happening as she quickly stepped outside. Her eyes were blazing with anger. "If you're not going to mind your business, take your gossip elsewhere," she shouted. "We're not harming anyone here, but if you harass Sophia again, you'll regret it." The women grumbled and dispersed. When Margaret turned to me, her eyes were still determined, but her voice was gentle. "Sophia, let them go. People are quick to judge what they don't understand, but you don't have to take their words to heart." I took a deep breath, but I couldn't stop the tears from welling up in my eyes. "Margaret, I shouldn't be here. I'm causing you trouble. People are afraid to come to your bakery because of me. It's hurting your business." For a moment, sadness flickered across Margaret's face, but she quickly placed her hands on my shoulders and looked straight at me. "Sophia, this bakery is more than just a business. It's my home, and no one can force you out of my home. Don't blame yourself for anything. You belong here." Her words comforted me for a while, but the tension in the neighborhood didn't fade. One afternoon, as I was arranging the tables outside the bakery, Carlos and a few of his friends appeared out of nowhere. My heart raced as they approached. Carlos was one of the most troublesome men in the area and had threatened me before. "Well, hello there, little girl," Carlos said with a sly grin. "Still working here. I wonder how long Margaret's patience will last. I glanced around nervously, but Margaret was inside and hadn't come out yet. Trying to suppress my fear, I said, "Please leave me alone. I don't want any trouble. I'm just doing my job." Carlos took a few steps closer. "Doing your job, huh? What business does someone like you have here? This neighborhood doesn't need people like you causing problems." "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling. I clasped my hands behind me and took a step back, but there was nowhere to run. One of Carlos's friends sneered and added, "Tell your boss to get rid of you. Otherwise, things might get difficult." At that moment, Margaret burst out of the bakery, holding a large wooden spoon. She marched straight toward Carlos. "Get out of here!" she yelled. "If you ever bother Sophia again, I'll report you to the police." Carlos stepped back, startled by Margaret's fierce determination, but his smirk didn't fade. "Suit yourself, old woman. But let's see how long this bakery lasts," he said before walking away with his friends. Margaret was doing everything she could to protect me, but I didn't know how much longer we could endure these threats. Each day, I felt more isolated. Still, Margaret's unwavering support gave me strength. I knew I had to fight this battle, not just for myself, but for her. Margaret's bakery had become my home, but that home was now under threat. Carlos and his friends' threats, the neighborhood gossip, and the dwindling number of customers were taking a toll on Margaret. One evening, as we sat together in the kitchen, I noticed the exhaustion etched into her face. She was carefully going through a stack of bills, but the worry in her eyes was impossible to hide. "Margaret, is something wrong?" I asked, my voice trembling. Margaret looked up and gave me a small smile, but it was shadowed by sadness. "Oh, Sophia, everything's fine. Just some bills that need paying. Nothing for you to worry about." But I was worried. I knew the bakery was struggling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was because of me. That night, as I lay in bed, guilt consumed me. Margaret protected me every time, but all I did was add to her burden. The next morning, I woke up early. Margaret was still asleep, her face peaceful. Seeing her like that brought tears to my eyes. I could never forget the love and support she had shown me, but I couldn't stay any longer. I couldn't bear to hurt her anymore. Quietly, I wrote a note and placed it on the table. "Dear Margaret, you've been more than a mother to me. But if I stay here, I'm afraid I'll cause you more harm. That's why I have to leave. I'll always love you, and I promise to return. One day, love, Sophia." My hands trembled as I placed the note on the table. I looked at Margaret one last time, but I couldn't find the courage to say goodbye face to face. I packed my bag and slipped out of the bakery. As I walked down the street, tears streamed down my face. There was an emptiness inside me, but I felt like I had no other choice. After leaving the bakery, I wandered into a quieter part of the city. I found a cheap boarding house, but I only had enough money to stay for a few days. The owner, Dolores, was a stern woman. As she handed me the key, she said, "If you can't pay, you'll be out immediately." The room was small, dark, and damp. I shut the door and sat on the bed. Placing my hands on my stomach, I whispered, "Anna, we need to be strong." But finding that strength felt nearly impossible. The next day, I went out looking for work. I knocked on doors and inquired everywhere I could, but I was turned away at every place. "We're not hiring," they said. Some people gave me disdainful looks and laughed, saying, "This isn't the place for someone like you." Their words cut through me like knives. When I returned to the boarding house that evening, I was greeted by the sound of children laughing. They had gathered in front of my room, mocking me. "Look at her! Her belly's as big as a balloon!" one of them shouted. Another threw a small stone. It felt as if it hit my heart, but I didn't respond. I just went inside, shut the door, and cried silently. One morning, Dolores stormed into my room, accusing me. "My money is missing. Did you take it?" she shouted angrily. Startled, I backed away. "No, I didn't take anything," I said, but her anger didn't subside. "Liar, if you don't return my money, you're out of here," she threatened. overwhelmed by her accusations. I couldn't fight back. Later that day, I returned to my room to find the door ajar and my belongings scattered on the floor. My meager savings were gone. "Why does everyone treat me like this?" I cried out, collapsing to the ground. Clutching my stomach, I whispered, "Anna, I'm scared I won't be able to protect you." What are we going to do? I had no choice but to leave the boarding house. With a small bag slung over my shoulder, I wandered the streets. Everything felt like it was against me. The cold, the hunger, the stares of strangers. I didn't know how much longer I could survive. Night fell, and I curled up in a corner under the dim light of a street lamp. Wrapping my hands around my stomach, I tried to shield Anna from the cold. Suddenly, I heard a voice. "Sophia!" I looked up to see Margaret, her face full of worry, holding a flashlight. Tears filled my eyes. "How did you find me?" I whispered. "I saw the note you left and started searching for you," she said, her voice a mix of anger and love. She crouched down and wrapped her arms around me. "Sophia, I won't leave you. No matter where you go, I'll find you." In that moment, I forgot the pain of the world for a while. I cried, but this time I cried knowing I wasn't alone. "I'm sorry," I said through my tears. Margaret looked at me and smiled. "There's nothing to forgive. You're my family, Sophia." That night, Margaret took me back to the bakery. I felt as though I had found my home again, but deep down, I knew the real battle was just beginning. That night in Margaret's arms, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. In a world where everyone had turned their back on me, Margaret had become my family. Yet deep inside, a sense of unease lingered. I didn't want to burden her any longer. The bakery was on the brink of closure because of me. Debts were piling up, and the gossip in the neighborhood was escalating. Something had to change. The next morning, as we returned to the bakery, Margaret called me into the kitchen. "Sophia, life is not easy, but we don't have the luxury of giving up. We're going to keep this bakery alive. But we have to do it together," she said. Her words planted a seed of hope in me, though I wasn't sure where I'd find the strength to make them come true. That morning, as I kneaded dough with her, my hands trembled. My mind was clouded by the injustices I'd faced, yet a small spark of hope flickered within me. Perhaps together, we could revive the bakery. For the next week, we worked under the weight of neighborhood gossip and veiled threats. Customers had dwindled. Many still couldn't accept Margaret's decision to let me work there. By the weekend, an unexpected visitor arrived, a woman named Julia, an old friend of Margaret's whom she hadn't seen in years. "Margaret, it's so lovely to see you, and this young girl hard at work," Julia said with a warm smile. But there was a hint of curiosity in her expression. "But tell me, why are people in the neighborhood so harsh about her?" Margaret explained the situation in detail. Julia shook her head, disapproving of the gossip. "People can be so cruel," she said, "but I see something in this girl, a spark. Sophia, I hope you won't let them drag you down." Julia's words struck a chord in me. My entire life I'd allowed others' judgments to weigh me down, but her simple gesture of encouragement awakened a new courage within me. At that moment, I made a decision. I would stand on my own 2 feet, repay Margaret for her kindness, and provide a secure life for my child. The next day, I told Margaret, "I need to do something to help the bakery. We need to find a way to bring customers back." Margaret shook her head gently. "Sophia, you're not alone in this. This bakery stands because of strong girls like you. But if you have a plan, I'm with you." As I gazed at the empty walls of the bakery, an idea came to me. Memories of my childhood surfaced, recalling the cookies my mother used to make. "Why don't we try something special?" I suggested. "We could draw people back with a new recipe." Margaret squinted at me with curiosity. "What do you have in mind?" Excitedly, I got to work in the kitchen. For hours, I experimented, trying to recreate the flavors of my memories. Finally, I produced a batch of cookies, spiced and packed with chocolate. Margaret picked one up, took a bite, and her eyes lit up. "These are incredible." Sophia, these cookies could make waves in the neighborhood. The next morning, we set up a table outside the bakery. The aroma of warm cookies wafted through the street, catching the attention of passers-by. At first, people only glanced and murmured, hesitant to approach. Then a few children tugged at their mother's sleeves, pleading, "Can we try one of those cookies?" Slowly, some parents gave in and approached the table. Our first customer was the mother of one of Carlos's troublesome friends. She stood at a distance but eventually gave in to the irresistible scent. She hesitantly took a cookie and bit into it. Her face softened with a smile. "This is amazing," she said. "Can I buy more?" That day, we sold nearly all the cookies. Margaret and I exchanged excited looks and rushed back to the kitchen to bake more. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope for the bakery's future. However, our small success didn't completely erase the prejudice in the neighborhood. Carlos and his friends returned, shouting threats outside the bakery. "You can't disturb the peace of this neighborhood," they yelled. But this time, the community stood with us. Julia stepped forward, standing her ground against Carlos. "If you touch this bakery again, we'll all report you to the police," she declared. Carlos stormed off in frustration, and for the first time, I realized there were still good people in the world. That moment showed me the power of solidarity and gave me strength to keep fighting. Margaret and I weren't just running a bakery anymore. We were building a home and reclaiming a sense of belonging for ourselves and for others who needed it. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I knew we weren't walking it alone.